All right, welcome back, guys. Today we're going to be talking about the European Age of Exploration, and we're going to start with the factors that motivated Europeans. Why are they going to go to the New World? How come they didn't discover it sooner? What caused them to start seeking this out for the first time in the 15th century, which is the 1400s? So when you look at motivating factors, there is the Roman Empire back 2,000 years ago, the Western Roman Empire that falls and collapses, and you have the Dark Ages, time period where Europe is really isolated. And they're keeping to themselves, and they don't want to, and they don't know what else is out there. So the difference is going to be what gives them a taste and the feeling and the impetus to look outside of their continents. And that's where the Crusades come in. Pope Urban II in 1095 issues the declaration for the First Crusade. Basically, the call for Christian Europeans to take up arms against Muslims and take back the Holy Land, Jerusalem, which was in the east for them at the time. That's where Israel is today, on the east coast of the Mediterranean. And so these Europeans who had been isolated for so long go on these crusades. There's many crusades, and most of them were disasters, and a few of them kind of triumphed. Mostly in the long term, we view the crusades extremely negatively because, of course, that's going to lead to a lot of the animosity that we have with that region of the world today, the Middle East. But there are some positives, actually. I know, right? I'm defending the Crusades. What was weird. But some of the positives are that it gives the Europeans a taste for the East. It lets them know what is out there. It gets them excited about the prospect of trade goods from not only the Middle East, but also India and China, like the Far East at the time it was called. As they're doing these battles, they're also having to live in this foreign land. Um, they're having to trade, they're having to get food and different fruit and dates. They're tasting all kinds of different teas, and they're getting porcelain and silk and all these other stuff that they bring back with them when they eventually return to Europe after these battles and wars, the Crusades. So that is a big positive of the Crusades. It gets Europe interested in what is out there, gives them a taste. um, and you also need bigger kingdoms, more organized central planning to launch these crusades than what a lot of the nobility could arrange at the time. So it puts more an emphasis on kings. Like in England, King Richard the Lionhearted, Richard III, he becomes very important and this well-known figure, all because of the crusades. You can't have lords leading this, you need kings. Whoops, sorry. So the Crusades give a taste. The Black Plague, or the bubonic plague, which is really going to have its day in the 1300s, as the Crusades are ongoing, is also going to have an effect on Europe's exploration, getting Europe exploring, because so many Europeans die, right? Like a third of the European population is gone. And a lot of those, the biggest population group when you're looking at feudalism would be the bottom of the pyramid. And who is the bottom of the pyramid, right? It's the peasants who, in the feudal system of Europe in the medieval times, were known as the serfs. These were the people who largely existed by farming, and they didn't own the land, and they had to give their crops over to the vassals, their lords, usually the knights, or the nominal lords, who would give it in turn to their um, nobility, would in turn give it to their kings. That's the feudal system. Well, when a third of Europe's population dies, that's hitting the serf class the hardest. Serfs can no longer be treated like less than dirt. This is a basic supply and demand type situation. That's a basic economic principle, right? When there's less of something, it becomes more valuable. So having so many less serfs, now they're going to be more valuable. They're going to demand more pay. And that kind of does away with a lot of those lower vassal like nobility lords. Okay, now there's more an emphasis on the kingdom, the kings, and the higher nobility. You can't have as many of them because now the serf class and the middle class are on the rise. So that will contribute to the rise of nation states, which are going to be important for this age of exploration. It's not until this time period, we're talking late 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, when you really start to see the modern nations of Western Europe take shape. And without them, exploration would not have been possible, right? I mean, you think Columbus, well, how did he get the money for his trips? King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, right? They provided the funding. They could not have done that without these other factors, okay? You think of Virginia, Jamestown, okay? Virginia's named after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth. Now, she's not going to have much to do with Jamestown, but this is all England, right? England, Spain, France, Portugal, these nations would not have been possible without these factors. The Silk Road is the ancient trade route, thousands of miles long, that exists between Europe all the way, it's a land route, all the way across the Middle East, across the Gobi Desert, all the way to China. And this is a trade route that existed since Roman times, so for over 2,000 years, the Silk Road. But like I said, during the Dark Ages, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 400s, it's largely going to be abandoned by many Europeans. Okay. And it's not until really Marco Polo's father and uncle, they were some of the first middle age explorers to really report this, and then brought, of course, Marco Polo, who's going to very much report his findings about this. It's going to renew again trade and interest in the East and Eastern products, stuff you get over here. Okay, so that's the Silk Road. Marco Polo's Travels, or the Travel of Marco Polo, is a book that is going to be written while Marco Polo is in jail during the city-state wars in Italy in the late 1200s after his journey. Written by his cellmate Rusticello as he tells these stories to him. But Marco Polo, as a 17-year-old, goes with the father and uncle that he's never known because they've been traveling to China and back his entire life. And they go back to the great court of the Mongol emperor of China, Kublai Khan, who's, by the way, the grandson of, you guessed it, Genghis Khan. There you go. So yes, this is Mongol time. And they go on this journey, and Marco Polo, of course, he witnesses and he writes in his journal, about all the amazing and interesting things he sees. He talks about, hey guys, in Europe, y'all don't know what unicorns are about. Okay, let me tell you the real story about unicorns. See, and he describes unicorns as being ugly and gray and wrinkly, and they're mean and fat, and they'll stomp you to death, and they like to roll in mud, and they're just disgusting creatures. And their horns are like in the middle of their faces, and it's like, man, did they have the unicorns wrong, right? Well, he was describing a rhinoceros. Europeans had never seen rhinos before, so yeah, that's one example, but all these new things he describes, and like I said, when he comes back, it gets compiled by cellmate into the famous book, The Travels of Marco Polo. And I bring this up along with the printing press, which came about in the 1440s, just a few decades before Christopher Columbus is going to make his journey, because these things are very important for the age of exploration. Because it's not just about, the naval technology we're going to see. It's also about the spread of ideas and interest and engagement and the desire to want to travel. And that's what Marco Polo's book did. In fact, as far as the printing press, the Gutenberg printing press goes, the two most popular books that were made mass, millions of copies of, the highest number of copies made was on the Bible, the King James Version of the Holy Bible. And the second highest number of copies made during the early run of the printing press, the movable type and all that, was the Travels of Marco Polo, of which a battered copy was taken along with the Bible, by Christopher Columbus when he made his first very important journey in 1492 across the Atlantic Ocean. He even earmarked the pages and had notes and everything else in his copy of Marco Polo's travels, so that when Columbus was going to be, he thought meeting Kublai Khan or whoever the descendant of Kublai Khan was, and entertaining the Chinese court, that he would know what to say and what it would be like. Because remember, Columbus thinks that he's going to the Far East. That's why he names the indigenous people that he finds when he lands the Indians, because he thinks he's landed in India. So all of these things kind of tie together. It's about interest, taste for the East, the desire to get over there, desire to find a faster way over there. And keep in mind also one other thing with the Silk Road, this is very dangerous to travel across land. It's also very cumbersome, meaning how much can you really haul on camel or horseback across all these sands and mountains and everything else? Not to mention, you have to go through the middleman. In Italy at the time, this is Renaissance time, you have these city states operating. You have Genoa, you have Venice. These places are desiring a huge like middleman fee for all of these really valuable trade goods that they're bringing over from thousands of miles across the Silk Road, across in their ships in the Mediterranean. That's the final leg there. And to get those things over to France or to Britain or, excuse me, England, or to Spain or Portugal over here on the Iberian Peninsula, they're getting an enormous slice of the profits. So what do you want to do? You want to cut out the middleman, and that's where a sea route becomes so important. Everybody in Western Europe over here, they're desiring a sea route to get around the middleman, to get around these Italian merchants, so that they don't have to do this cumbersome, long silk, overland trade route. I would be remiss if, of course, we didn't talk about the actual technology that would make this exploration possible, but it's not as exciting as like the story of like unicorns and rhinoceroses. Rhinos. There we go. But anyway, we will talk briefly about this. Prince Henry the Navigator was a Portuguese nobleman, not actually a prince, kind of a misnomer. But he's going to be very important in financing and sponsoring many of the Portuguese explorers who are going to kick off this age of exploration. And his school is going to be where a lot of the technology that makes the age of exploration possible is going to be taught. So cartography, the study of map making, huge advances during the 1400s are going to be very important. The Madeira Islands, the Azores, discovered by Portugal, also going to kind of kick this off during this early period. The compass, the magnetic compass brought over from China, that's going to be very important, obviously. Astrolabe, astrolabes are going to be made, kind of a different version of the astrolabe will be used for naval exploration. And this is where you can triangulate your location by a latitude based on your relation to the stars. And I have never actually used an astrolabe, but that's pretty important if you're in the middle of open water, middle of the ocean, for trying to figure out where the heck you are. That was the best that they had for determining that latitude, was the astrolabe. So very important. Triangular sails, those are called lateen sails. I think last year when I was teaching my students this, I think I said latrine. I'm just going. And I said latrine, and then some of my students were like, they were giving me a face, and it was like, like you just bit really hard into a lemon. And I was like, what is it? And they're like, what kind of sail is that? I guess they were imagining like poop, like all over the sails or something. It's the only thing I could imagine. But anyway, it's a lateen sail, not a latrine sail, luckily. These triangular sails, like this one right here on the Caravel ship, that's a Portuguese small, quick sailing ship developed at this time. It's going to be most of the early explorations we're talking about will be on the Portuguese caravels. In fact, the Nina and the Pinta that Columbus takes were caravels. But the triangular sail was so important because it could actually go into the wind. Now think about that. You're sailing with a big, like, square sail. That's great for catching lots of wind, but you can only go in the direction that the wind is pushing you. If the wind is not on your side and you need to go the way that the wind is not, pushing you towards, you're stuck. Like, you're done. That's it. Game over. With a lateen sail, you can actually go into the wind. Okay, you can go any direction. That opens up all